Let's get started on Module 4, vCenter Server. In this module, we will look at vCenter Server architecture and the purpose of vCenter Server, and we will look at managing vCenter Server inventory, particularly creating and configuring virtual machines. We'll start out with vCenter Server architecture. You can, as you saw from the last chapter, you can configure ESXi host from the vSphere client. You use the vSphere client to configure the ESXi host. You use the vSphere client to connect to a single ESXi host. So if you have 3 ESXi hosts in the data center, you connect to the hosts one at a time, and that's not much of a problem. However, if you have a big data center with a lot of ESXi hosts, connecting to those hosts one at a time can be awfully time-consuming and labor-intensive. So the solution is vCenter Server. vCenter Server is a centralized configuration server that allows you to connect to and configure multiple hosts and VMs. vCenter Server is a single server that allows you to connect to and configure many ESXi hosts and many virtual machines. If we compare this to connecting to a single host, whereby we're configuring one host at a time, we will see that vCenter Server allows us to configure and connect to a large number of ESXi hosts and virtual machines. With the vCenter Server management platform, vCenter Server allows you to manage a large number of virtual machines on a large number of ESXi hosts, and it allows you to manage and configure data stores on storage area networks. vCenter Server is similar to Active Directory in that Active Directory is used to configure and manage multiple servers from one single location. If we go to VMware's website, we say that VMware vCenter Server provides a centralized platform for managing your vSphere environment. We will see that there are two, if we click on Buy Online, we'll see there are two editions. There is the vCenter Server Foundation Edition, which is for small, very small networks of only 3 vSphere hosts, or vCenter Standard Edition, which is used for larger deployments such as CCBC, Community College of Baltimore County. Let's download the vSphere, the vCenter Server, so we can install it. If you go to VMware website, you will see that you can download a free trial, and when you install it, it's the full-blown version. It's just that within 60 days you got to type in the license key. So what you will probably do is to download the free trial. When you download the vCenter Server, you download it as a 3 gig ISO file. So you select download now, and it downloads the ISO file. And then after the ISO file has been downloaded, then you can burn the ISO file to the DVD, and that makes it an install DVD to install the vCenter Server. So vCenter Server is typically installed on a Windows server, and it's typically installed from the DVD, or you could install it directly from the ISO. After we put the DVD in, we see the vCenter Server installation screen. And if we select vCenter Server, we say that vCenter Server manages data center access control, performance monitoring, and configuration. And then we can click Install to install vCenter Server. And then it begins the long process of doing the installation of vCenter Server, which I will exit out of. And now to connect to the vCenter server, we use the vSphere client. We sit at the vSphere client, which is just a Windows 7 PC, and then connect to the vCenter server, which is then connected to all of the other ESXi hosts. So we click on the vSphere client and we type in the IP address. Now look at this. It's not the IP address of the ESXi host. It's the IP address of the Windows server that we install on the ESXi host. And also, notice, we're not logging in as root because that's the login name for the ESXi host. We're logging in as administrator because that's the login name for the Windows server. We click on log on, and we're now connected to the vCenter server. And typically what we do is we go to hosts and clusters. That's where most of our work is done. We click on hosts and clusters, and we can see that in this vCenter server there is a data center, and in the data center there are two ESXi hosts. There are two ESXi hosts connected, and they're not using much CPU. They are using a bit of memory. And then you can see that there are 7 virtual machines running, and one virtual machine is using a lot of processor utilization, other virtual machines not using much. If I want to, I can right click and I can select virtual machine. I can create a virtual machine on this ESXi host or a virtual machine on this ESXi host. The point is I don't have to log into one ESXi host after the other. I just log into the vCenter server. It allows me to connect to any of the ESXi hosts and then proceed to make a virtual machine, which I will skip right now. So a vCenter server is a central location that allows you to configure and manage a single server that allows you to configure and manage multiple hosts and multiple VMs and data stores as well. Where to install vCenter server? Typically, we think of installing a vCenter server on a separate physical server. That's one way to go. But you can install vCenter server on a virtual machine on an ESXi host. 2 ways to install vCenter server. And we will go into installation of vCenter server in greater detail in Chapter 14. Using vCenter server. This is called managing the vCenter server inventory. And the first thing we do is we create a data center. What is a data center? A data center is the primary container of inventory objects such as hosts and virtual machines. So let's do it. Let's connect to the vCenter server. Connect to the vCenter server. Create a data center, add hosts, and create virtual machines. I click on the vSphere client and I type in the IP address of the Windows server that has vSphere installed on it, and vCenter server installed on it. Click on log on. And I go to the vCenter server and I right click and I select new data center. I'll call the data center 1. And after I've created the data center, the next thing to do is to add the ESXi hosts. So then I right click on data center and select add new host, and I type in the IP address of the ESXi host that I installed a little while ago. And then I type in the username, which is root. Wait a minute, I thought it was administrator. Root is the administrator name of the ESXi host. Administrator is the administrator name of the vCenter server. So what this is doing is it's telling me I've got the authorization to add this host to this data center. I click on next. It shows the certificate. Do you wish to proceed? Yes, because I installed it. It shows any virtual machines that may already be running on that host, followed by next. I can type in the license key now, or I can do it later once I've got everything running the right way. I will not enable lockdown mode. It will be stored in the data center one, of course, and then I click on finish, and now I can see I have added a new ESXi host to the data center. And then let's do it again, another one. I'll just do a quickie version. Right click, select add host, select all the defaults, type in the IP address, root name, password, select all the defaults, and now you can see I have added 2 ESXi hosts to the vCenter server. And now I can configure and manage these ESXi hosts without having to log into them individually. Now that we have connected to these ESXi hosts, let's create virtual machines. And this is really a rehash of what we did in the previous chapter. The only difference is we're creating virtual machines using vCenter. So I will select the host that I want to create the virtual machine on, right click, select new virtual machine. Then I'll select custom configuration, followed by next. I will type in the name of the virtual machine, such as accounting server, followed by next. I will specify the data store where it's going to be stored, followed by next. I will select typically the newest and latest virtual machine version because we're not installing any legacy hardware or software here, followed by next. I select the operating system that I plan to install into that virtual machine, such as Windows 2012 Server. I specify the number of CPUs that I want to assign to that virtual machine. I specify the amount of RAM that I want to assign to the virtual machine. Could be 64, but I'll leave it at 4. I will specify the type of network card, which is just the standard Intel gigabit network card. Typically we use the LSA, Logic Serial Attached Storage SCSI controller, followed by next. We will create a new virtual disk, followed by next. The virtual disk will be 40 gig. We'll do thick provisioned. If we want, we could store it separately on the SAN data store, followed by next. Followed by next. Typically it's the first SCSI device, followed by next. We click on finish, and that creates the new virtual machine, and there's the new virtual machine right there. It's running. I mean, it's installed, but it's not running. So to get that so after we create the virtual machine, then we install the guest operating system of the virtual machine, whether it's 2008 server, 2012 server, Linux, or AIX, which is an IBM version of Linux. I go to the virtual server, and just like we did in the previous chapter, right-click. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. To make sure it boots from the correct DVD, right-click and select Edit Settings. And where is the DVD going to be plugged in? Well, the DVD is going to be plugged into the same computer that the virtual machine is on. Host device means that the virtual machine is going to read from the DVD reader, which is in the same computer as the ESXi host, and that is a common way to do it. Or we could install from an ISO data store. I'll just leave it, the DVD is in the host device, followed by OK. Then we start let's say I launch the virtual machine. Then I go to the accounting server, and I right-click, and I select Power On. And then if I click, and then the machine powers on. Then if I click on Launch Virtual Machine Console, I can now see it has booted up to the installed disk of Windows 2012 Server. And as you know, this course we don't teach 2012 Server, at least you'll be able to install it. So we take all the defaults, we click on Next, and we accept the licensing agreement, and then we watch all the files as they get copied from the DVD to the virtual disk. And that reboots, and I type in my username and password, and now I am booted to Windows 2008 Server. And then typically after we do that, we install VMware tool. which we did in the previous chapter and we will do again in chapter 14. We select VM, followed by guest, followed by guest, followed by install VMware tools. We click on OK, click on next, and it installs VMware tools. And then we reboot the machine, and now we see that VMware tools is currently running. And then if I want to see what I'm doing a little bit better, I can click on View, followed by Full Screen Mode, and this allows me to get a better view of that Windows 2012 server running the virtual machine. On the top right, you can see a tab that says Map. And if we click on the tab that says Map, it shows a nice little network map of our 2 ESXi hosts, of our 7 virtual machines, and of our 2 data stores. Creating folders. The reason we create folders is so we can group similar VMs together. And if you know what it means to make a folder on the hard disk, it's the same thing. Folder on the hard disk is used to group like files together. A folder on vSphere, on vCenter server, is used to group like virtual machines together. So here's the example. I go to Data Center 1 and I right click and I select New Folder, and I'll call it, for example, Administrative Folder here at CCBC. And I'll right click and I'll select New Folder, and I will make this the Faculty folder. And then what I will do is I will drag and drop and move the virtual machines in the folder, and this groups them together. So now you can see there's a folder for faculty, and there are a couple of VMs there. And there's another folder for administration, and there are a few VMs there. And there's another folder for students. Folders work the same way on hard disk. They're just a convenient way. The folders work the same way they work on a hard disk. It's just a convenient way to group virtual machines together. Didn't we talk about licensing earlier? Yes, we did, but we configured the license of the ESXi host by going directly to it. We can use vCenter Server to centrally manage our licenses. So we can connect to any ESXi host and enter the license and product key. License consists of 3 things: product, key, and asset. The product in this case would be vSphere Enterprise. The license key is represented by all the X's here, and the asset is the computer on which it is installed. So the vCenter server allows us to view and configure licenses of all the different ESXi hosts without having to connect to them one at a time. In your lab, I will ask you to connect to a vCenter server and examine all tabs, including summary, virtual machine, configuration. Then I will ask you to install the license keys. Didn't we do this in a previous lab? Yeah, but it was done using the vSphere client directly to the ESXi host. We're doing the same thing, but we're doing it using the vSphere, the vCenter server. Then, after you connect to the data center and install license keys or examine license keys, then create a data center object, then add an ESXi host to the inventory, then create a virtual machine, and you see it's really no different creating a virtual machine under the vCenter server, and then create folder object. Let's now discuss the vCenter Server Virtual Appliance. We will just do a brief overview of the vCenter Server Virtual Appliance. We will cover it in greater detail in Chapter 14. So, vCenter Server can be installed as an appliance. So, what is an appliance? Because we're going to be coming across this term again and again in the course. In typical virtual server setup tasks, 1, you create the virtual machine. 2, you install the guest operating system and usually install VMware tools as well. 3, you install the application. And the disadvantage of that is 3 separate steps can be time consuming. We can consolidate that into one step by using a virtual appliance? A virtual appliance is a piece of software that contains a virtual machine with the operating system installed and the application installed. And the reason we do it is because there is a one-step installation process instead of a 3 to 4-step installation process. The vCenter server appliance includes 3 things. 1, the virtual machine. 2, the operating system on which the application is built, in this case Linux, and an application, and the application is vCenter server. And the reason that we do it is ease of installation. 1 step instead of 3 steps. So vCenter server can be installed as a virtual appliance, and we will cover it in greater detail in Module 14. In summary, in this chapter, we looked at the vCenter server architecture and saw that vCenter server is a central point of ESXi host configuration. And then managing the vCenter server means creating virtual machines. It means other things as well, such as creating virtual disks and creating virtual networks, which will be covered later in this course. And this concludes Module 4, vCenter server. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.